Hi, and welcome to Shorts in Psychology. Today I'm going to briefly describe the main characteristics of two of the investigation design types used in psychological research, followed by some illustrative examples from past exams. The experimental investigation design is used to test whether one variable or factor, the independent variable, influences or causes a change in another variable, the dependent variable. This independent variable is manipulated by the researcher. The presence of a control group, which is where the independent variable is either zero or absent, allows the researcher to establish causation. In other words, they can establish that it's the independent variable that is responsible for the change observed in the dependent variable. In this design, random allocation is used to determine whether participants are placed in the control group or the treatment groups. Random allocation uses chance to assign the participants so they have an equal opportunity of being in either group. This ensures that experimenter effect doesn't influence the placement of the participants. The experimental investigation design also yields a lot of control over extraneous variables, including situational variables and participant variables. While this increases the confidence that it is in fact the independent variable responsible for the observed change in the dependent variable, it does result in a very artificial environment, which means that often the results cannot necessarily be applied to the real world. This design also often involves pre- and post-testing, which is taking a measurement before altering the independent variable or applying the treatment. It also involves testing a hypothesis. The quantitative observational design is often referred to as being quasi-experimental. This is because it has some of the features of the experimental design, but not all of them. For example, the independent variable changes in this design as well. However, it changes naturally, which means that the groups are pre-existing and the researcher is simply observing and collecting quantitative data. This means that a control group may still be present, but not always. Because the groups are pre-existing, it also means that random allocation is unable to be used. Let's apply what you know about the experimental and quantitative observational investigation designs to some past exam questions. Pause the video while you take a minute to read through the scenario and attempt part A. So this question asks you to describe one feature of the procedure that identifies this as an experimental design. The question is worth 2 marks, which means that you need one well-made point with an example. In other words, you want to define your feature of the experimental design, linking it to the scenario. So one feature that you could describe here could be random allocation. If we refer to the scenario states that each participant in a pair had an equal chance of being assigned to Group A or Group B. Another feature that identifies it as an experimental design is the presence of the control group. Because the psychologist is interested in the development of numeracy, Group A, which is watching the numeracy programs, is the treatment group, and Group B, which are watching cartoons, are your control group, which provide the baseline for comparison to Group A. Another feature of the experimental group that exists here is the fact that pre- and post-testing was conducted. In other words, test 1, which is the initial test, is the pre-test, and then test 2 following the treatment, the exposure to either the numeracy or the cartoons, is the post-test. Lastly, another feature that you could describe is the fact that the psychologist is the one deliberately manipulating the independent variable. The independent variable here, of course, is the program that the students are watching, and so they are deliberately manipulating whether the students are watching a numeracy program or a cartoon. This question is a more challenging application question because instead of having to justify why the given scenario is an experimental investigation design, it's actually asking you to describe the design itself in terms of how the researcher would actually conduct it. Pause the video and take a few minutes to read through the question and actually think about how you would answer this one. Probably the easiest features to describe here would be the deliberate manipulation of the independent variable or the presence of a control group. This would involve describing a fairly similar scenario, it's just the feature that you're defining in the context of that scenario would be slightly different. In other words, you could say, well, the researcher would have two groups. One group would be exposed to a loud noise. The other group would not be exposed to a loud noise. That group is the control group. And then you would measure their abilities to solve puzzles and you would compare the results to see whether that loud noise has caused a reduction. So in that scenario, not only are you describing the presence of a control group, but you're also clearly explaining that the researcher is the one that has deliberately manipulated that independent variable. In other words, whether the participants are exposed to a loud noise or not. You could alternatively discuss random allocation here. So you'd have your loud noise group, you'd have your group that isn't exposed to noise, and you could define what random allocation is and then explain how it could be used to assign your participants to those two groups. Lastly, you could discuss pre and post testing. So the researcher might measure participants' ability to solve puzzles first, then expose them to a loud noise or not, and then again measure their ability to solve puzzles to see whether there's a difference following exposure to the loud noise. As for the first question, this one is asking you to explain why the scenario given is a specific design type. Pause the video and have a read of the question and attempt parts A and B. If we have a look at the scenario, you can see that it's about a psychologist who's investigating the relationship between shift work and fatigue. So participants have been selected from two groups, either night shift or day shift workers. The fact that participants have been selected from pre-existing groups is a clear indicator that it's a quantitative observational design. The researcher has not deliberately manipulated the independent variable. The participants were already in one of those two groups and random allocation therefore has not been used. The question then goes on to describe one advantage of using this design type for this specific investigation. The quantitative observational design can be really useful when it's unethical to conduct an experiment. So you could argue that deliberately exposing people to shift work and subjecting them to fatigue would be unethical and therefore it would be impossible to conduct an experiment. By choosing participants from pre-existing groups and doing a quantitative observational investigation, the researcher is still able to investigate her question. Pause the video again to read through the scenario and attempt part A for this question. So this question is asking you, based on the scenario, to discuss one disadvantage of using the quantitative observational design for this investigation. So as we know, the quantitative observational design doesn't use random allocation. The groups are pre-existing. In other words, they've got teams that wear red and they've recorded the number of wins and teams that wear other colours and compared their number of wins. So there are a lot of extraneous variables that will influence these results. Those teams that are wearing the different colours aren't necessarily teams with similar skill levels, and there'll be a wide range of participant variables that will influence the number of wins. Therefore, in this case, the researcher can't really conclude that it's the uniform colour that increases the probability of winning the sports matches as opposed to other factors such as the player's skill level. Pause the video to have a read through this final question and attempts both part 1 and 2. In part 1 of this question, you're simply being asked to identify the research design used. You don't need to give any justification, and while ideally you should spell it correctly, you won't be penalised for incorrect spelling. There are two things in this scenario that should indicate to you that it's the experimental design that's being used. First of all, it states that the participants were randomly assigned to one of two groups, but it also talks about the fact that there are two behavioural policies that have been identified and the groups are being instructed to follow one of the two policies. In other words, the researcher here is manipulating the independent variable and you have a control and treatment group. In part 2, you just have to explain one disadvantage of the experimental design, so it doesn't have to be applied to this scenario at all. So the most commonly given disadvantage is the fact that in the experimental design you do have a lot of control over extraneous variables, which causes the experiment to be conducted in a very artificial setting. As a result, the data that is generated can't necessarily be applied to the real world. Hopefully this video has been helpful clarifying the key characteristics of these two investigation design types and how to identify them in given scenarios in exam questions. Whenever you're tackling an exam scenario, the first thing to ask yourself is, are these groups pre-existing, or were they formed using random allocation? Is the independent variable being manipulated by the researcher, or is it changing naturally? Answering those two questions should help you determine whether it's the experimental or the quantitative observational design. I would also strongly suggest that you learn 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages of each design type, because as you've seen in the previous few questions, these are also commonly asked for in the exam. Good luck!